Well, I wanted to move into the keynote chat tonight, presentation and chat with Deb Kilpatrick. I'm going to read a quick intro about her that I pulled just this afternoon from LinkedIn. And then Deb's going to give us a quick overview about the company she leads, and then we're going to go into some Q&A here at the front of the room and hopefully just open it up for more of a conversation so that it's a little less formal. So here we go. Deb Kilpatrick is the current CEO of San Mateo-based Evidation Health. She's an industry executive with broad experience in development and commercialization of new medical technologies and products for primary care and specialty channels. Her operational roles have spanned domestic and global leadership in R&D, corporate strategic planning, and new technology incubation, as well as marketing, sales, and reimbursement in Fortune 500 and Silicon Valley startup healthcare companies. Co-founder of the first conference for women leaders focused on major healthcare trends impacting the medtech sector, now held annually in Silicon Valley. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this morning's news. There was an announcement that Evidation just closed its $15 million Series B round. And so with that, I'd like us to give a warm welcome to Deb and welcome her to tonight's meeting.
Thank you, Manny. So it's our pleasure to be here. There are several members of our team here tonight. So if you don't like what you hear from me about Team Evidation, you can obviously replace me with others here on the team that are just as capable, or if not better, than I am at talking about what we do. I'd like to start off, and I promise I will not use many slides, by the way. I promise. Matt Larwood is the one who made me use slides, so if you're angry about that, you can blame him. But I wanted to point out a few things, because I acknowledge that our website is vague and a little obtuse about what we do. That's sort of by design, and as Polly Ashrani, who's sitting here for our marketing team, can tell you, we're about to change that imminently now that we're sort of more out of the closet and our Series B is done. But the thing that I like to say whenever I talk in public about the company is that we really do bring the best in healthcare understanding, the best in healthcare use case understanding, incentive structure understanding, operational practices in terms of clinical trial design and improving impact and understanding how to navigate the complexities of the ecosystem with the very best of consumer technology. And I think anybody on our team would tell you that depending on what side of the fence they're on, they really defer very heavily to the others on the team. We have very good conversations. We have very good meetings of the minds. We view things through very different lenses. And so I'm giving you a sample of the logos up here to sort of prove that point. But I think what it means importantly for our customers and for our investors is when you work for us, we guarantee that you're going to get the best possible answer that you can get from those two sectors. And you're going to get it from one company. As Andy mentioned today, we did just publicly announce a Series B that we've closed today. B Capital Group is our new lead. We're really proud to have them on board and on the table. That's a new fund that's associated with BCG. They were a private financial firm, but their largest LP is BCG Consulting. And the founders of that come from Bain Capital, Raj Ganguly, as well as Eduardo Severin, who's the co-founder of Facebook. And I point that out because you're going to see, or you hear from me as we talk about what Evidation does and how we do it, there are very strong themes of patient mediation and consumer mediation of data in order to quantify the most incredibly important thing in health right now in our country, which is value based on outcome. And so those are the themes that we brought together around the investment table, as well as the way we do business. So Christine Lemke, who many of you guys will know as the co-founder of Evidation and the president of our company, she runs all the technology side. Christine and I spend a lot of time together, obviously, in customer meetings and investor meetings, and I tend to use a lot of multisyllabic, boring healthcare words, and she really cuts to the chase much better than me. And when she talks about what we do, this is what she says. And there's a really great snippet of Christine talking to Bloomberg News recently about what we do, and she verbatim says this. And so I'm trying to train myself to be more succinct. And what we do is we tell healthcare buyers and healthcare product companies what works. More importantly, I think if you're a product manufacturer or a product developer, we tell you who it's working in, when it's working, and how much it's working. And the reason that that matters is because in the future of value-based healthcare, you're going to need to price against that. And so when we talk to biotech or pharma, or when we talk to digital health companies, exactly the same conversation occurs with regard to how you want to quantify value, because you need to be able to answer these questions. The way we do it, which is unique to sort of our secret sauce, is we take all of the best data sources that have historically been used in healthcare to adjudicate outcomes, which is medical data. Medical data largely coming from episodic points in time, from clinical trials or from interactions with your healthcare provider. And we say all of that's important, but we're going to bring together all of the data that was historically invisible to the healthcare ecosystem, right? And what we at Evidation collectively refer to this as is real-life data. And so the world of data as it pertains to healthcare outcomes to us looks like this universe, right? So over here on the far left, we've got this very important, never going to go away, by the way, very important category of clinical trial data that I believe all regulated devices, therapeutics, digital health products will continue to be regulated in terms of their approval by agencies on the basis of, and control clinical trials. Increasingly, over the last 20 years in particular, real-world evidence or real-world practice data comes from adjudicated claims, both from medical claims as well as pharmaceutical claims, as well as provider system data, and most recently EHR data, right? So that's not a new type of data, it's just a new vehicle for getting data to us. What's altogether completely new is real-life data. And at Evidation, this is our bailiwick. This is what we really focus our efforts on because we think we're better at it than anybody else on the planet, which is taking all the ingestible behavior data that reflects what's going on outside the clinic walls, combining that with all of the sources of data that have been used traditionally in clinical trials and in outcomes definition, and using a whole new way through machine learning and analytics of quantifying outcomes that's never been before possible. Now this is incredibly important to those of you in the audience who are digital health companies, because largely I would argue that your value is going to be driven by this, not this. Your regulatory approval is driven by what's on the left, but your value in the world is driven by what's in the right. And the lucky thing is now for all of us that are in sort of new kinds of companies that have digital sources of data that can prove this, is now there's a way to quantify it. And I think in the future, not only are you going to be paid for it, but you're going to end up pricing against it, and that's going to be better for anybody, by the way, who's got the pricing, and anybody who has pricing advantage who has information advantage. So what we do is we have a software platform that's fairly complicated, but to the end customer, it's fairly simple. We give you an answer. And the way we give you an answer is by ingesting 3 different data types: behavioral data, which I just talked about, medical data, which is what we've used forever in healthcare, and contextual data. Now, contextual data is quite important because it is how we interpret whether or not behavioral data matters in the context of health. So for example, if I'm a routine exerciser and I exercise outside, and I do it routinely, and I log it in my Runkeeper app, and my Fitbit shows that I'm doing it every day, and all of a sudden I stop. I stop for a week. Am I stopped because it's raining and snoring outside, or am I stopped because I had the flu? Right, so contextual data like weather, like pollen count in chronic respiratory disease, like the pattern or derivatives of geolocation change, elevation, whether I'm at sea level or not. This becomes really, really important when you want to interpret behavioral data to make sense of it in terms of quantifying a health outcome. Now, I argue that the most important part of our platform is actually not the technology. I don't tell my data scientists this, or my software engineers this, but the most important part of our platform is at the bottom here, which is the connected populations. So at Evidation, we believe that the future will be patient-mediated. It doesn't mean that we believe that patients will pay for healthcare, because in this country I don't believe that we want to. That includes me, by the way. But I do believe that we all have an incredibly important asset in the digital era of medicine, and that's the data that we hold and that we give off all the time, 24 hours a day. Right? So we are all in connected populations. What's different is what context we're in and whether or not that context matters in terms of, in engineering, how we think of as a control volume, right? So sometimes our control volume is in the general population, and the distinction is whether we're a control or whether we're in a labeled population. Am I diabetic or non-diabetic? Am I a healthy control or do I have rheumatoid arthritis? Sometimes What provider system I'm in matters. Am I in Sutter Health? Am I at Palo Alto Medical Foundation in Sutter Health? Am I at Kaiser Permanente? Am I at CPMC? Am I at UCLA Cedars-Sinai? All of these things are relevant, right, in terms of disparities of care, my access to care, and the type of care that I'm going to get. Sometimes, though, it really matters the contextual or situational aspect of my life. So yes, I may be at Cedars-Sinai, yes, I may have rheumatoid arthritis, but you know what? I just had a new baby. So that situational fact, that contextual fact actually changes things. And so we really think of connected populations as being very affected by what's going on around them and the setting that they're in and the access to care that they're in. And at the end of the day, all of this becomes one giant big data problem. But if you put it in the format of a classically controlled clinical trial, whether it's a pre-post study, whether it's retrospective, whether it's prospective, whether it's randomized, whether it's blinded, whether it's controlled and multi-armed or not, all of that can be done, only now it can be done virtually. And so in Evidation, this is the graphical sort of representation of how we do what we do, but what we really do, I think of as in three categories. We empower broad populations to participate in studies. So right now, we're doing a number of different studies, but the largest one we're doing is 80,000 people. It's 80,000 people to help us understand whether certain digital strategies affect vaccination patterns in influenza. That's funded by the DoD. Now, it's funded by the DoD, but a lot of other entities have a lot of interest in that, right? And so, when's the last time we were able to do an 80,000 prospective study in healthcare? I've been in healthcare a long time, I can tell you I've never done one that big. Never, not close, right? We also really focus on quantified health outcomes that as I mentioned earlier, it accounts for the real life of patients. And so the fact that we are living multi-channel data lives doesn't stop when we go to the provider. It doesn't stop when we go to the doctor. That kind of multi-channel life should be relevant to how our outcomes of whatever's going on with us in healthcare are quantified. I think one of the most unsung sources of data historically in healthcare are patient-reported outcomes. There's been entire centers of NIH and FDA that are focused on patient-reported outcomes. But largely, if you really go and ask somebody who's a healthcare buyer, off the record, what do you think of patient-reported outcomes? They'll generally tell you they don't believe they're accurate, and they generally don't believe them, okay? Now, that's understandable historically because we weren't getting them in the right place. We were getting them from patient diaries about a symptom that happened a week ago or a month ago or a physician visit that, by the way, I don't even remember, right? And so patient-reported outcomes are now suddenly incredibly relevant, and they are ubiquitously available. And so we really truly believe that patient-reported outcomes should be part of quantified health outcomes, right? And so we add that in too. But as I mentioned earlier, the fact that we can use machine learning and analytics to do this at scale, even if we could do everything else I just imagined 5 years ago, we might not have been able to do it at scale, right? Because we still would have been working in Excel spreadsheets, largely speaking, maybe on steroids a little bit. But now we can do this really in an almost unlimited way. And so the technology side of Evidation Health largely comes from consumer technology. They think that those of us on the healthcare side are really cute when we get excited about running studies in 5,000 people. And they're like, oh, that's really quaint. Because they build scale for hundreds of millions of people. And so now we're able to bring all of that technology to bear into a context of running a prospective study that was really unfathomable even 5 years ago. And so what that does is that allows us to see signal that we could not see in populations that were unreachable, right? For example, the elderly, the people that are aging at home, the people who have rare and orphan diseases, right? And so people who were really unreachable either because they were invisible to the system or because they were at too big of a scale to see the signal in are now solvable problems. And so I think of these three categories of things as being what we're really bringing to the table as a company that get me very excited. And as you guys can probably tell, I get excited. We're hiring, and so I have to say that, Andy, before we start. If you like what I'm going to say, and you like some of the job opportunities say at Evidation Health, we are in growth mode. So we would love to have that conversation with you. So.
That's great. And so thinking about as traditional measures of progress in a company, at these younger stage companies, is traction. How many users do we have signed up? maybe not so much in terms of outcomes data, but who's going to be asking for this type of information for these young companies? Is it the insurance companies they're trying to sell to? Is it the consumer? How is this information consumed, and how would it advance companies to start thinking about it, and how would it fit into their pitches?
So, I think let's look at investors as a special category, right? Because I think y'all agree they're special. They know they're special. I'm in the audience, I'm offended when I say that, but they have a special view on a company, and whether you're a tech investor or a healthcare investor, they can have very different lenses, right? So I think the answer can be a little bit different with those two audiences or constituencies very specifically. I would rank of all the audiences you're trying to convince as a young company, period, health plans are the number one. Number one. Because it doesn't matter how many physicians think you're good. It doesn't matter how many patients download or use your thing. If you cannot get paid for the value that it brings, and by and large, most of our business models still rely on health plans, whether it's private plans or from Medicare or Medicaid, then you're not going to have a sustainable business model based on revenue in the U.S. healthcare system. Now, there are nuances to that, and I'm sure there are many companies in the audience that are going to get paid directly by consumers for the value of the healthcare system they bring. But I'm speaking more specifically to, point solutions or platforms that are playing like deeply in the healthcare space, and are not going to be paid by the patient as the end user, but they're going to be paid by something in the system, some entity paying them for the value that they bring. And by the way, value here, when I say value, I don't just mean economic value, I mean clinical value, right? If you're replacing something, you gotta be as good as that thing was, because no one's gonna pay you for worse care. So you've gotta be at least as good, and you cannot be more expensive for the identical care. You can argue for better economics or better pricing if you're better, but if you're not, generally speaking, that's going to be a tough road. And so I will always argue for the health plans being the number one most important buyer. And by the way, those of you who are in the channel of self-insured employers, that's a health plan channel. That's the same thing. So.
And keeping the focus on some of the examples that you cited before, DoDs, impressive set of customers. For folks that aren't quite yet at that volume, how might this crowd take what you have to talk about tonight and apply it to their daily lives? Are there on-ramps to work with Evidation at a young stage, or is this something once they're further down the line and maybe some funding in the bank to pay for services?
Yeah, actually, I would say, and there are people from our sales team here tonight, so hopefully they don't get mad at me throwing out pricing, because I know that's never the thing you want to do. But some of our engagements are as low as $50,000 or $75,000. Some of our engagements are in the millions, right? And so it's very variable and dependent on what it is you need and whether or not we prospectively need to go find people to prove it in. We have had many digital health companies, currently we have many digital health companies that come to us and say, I've got, let's make a number, I've got 50,000 users that have using my product or have downloaded it or are actively, my monthly active user volume is that, and but we're not sure exactly where the signal of value is, but we've got lots of data. And so one of the things we'll do, just right off the bat, because they may not know if they need to run a prospective trial, and A, and B, if they need to run one, what it should even go after as an endpoint. And so a lot of the things that we'll initially do will just be to look at, do really lots of analytics on the existing data that they have. In more than one case, we've come back and said, I know that you think you're doing this, and the bad news is you're not quite doing that as well as you think you are, but the good news is you're doing this, and you're doing it really well. And in more than one case, we've had a company say, I had no idea, would never thought about that, and by the way, we think your pricing is going to be better here, and so then we're going to launch this big prospective study just looking over here in a way that they would have never thought about bringing value. And so I would say there are many different ways to work with us, depending on the question that you're going to ask. A big driver of cost of working with us is always going to be whether you have existing data stores or whether we have existing data stores that can help you get the answer to the current business question, or whether we need to go out and recruit people on our platform to help you answer that. Right now, we're in the connected population category that I mentioned earlier. We're in active growth mode of those populations. We're at what, almost 500,000 today, is that right? distributed, generally speaking, throughout many therapeutic conditions and all across the US. So odds are, we've got lots of data that can already help you answer aside from our user base. But we do it all ways, and I don't want to lock an answer in on that because I'd rather you come to us, and if we can help you, we'll do it.
Seems reasonable.
Hi there, I'm Matthew Holt. So I want to ask you about your business model, because I'm very confused about, very young, I'm far too young to go work at Evidation. But in general, companies tech companies get paid, raise money, or product companies raise money to sell a lot of units of something. Either it's by self-service of SaaS players like Google or Salesforce, or it's because they sell a lot of stuff like the Moti, obviously the Moti sells a lot of stuff, but with that did. You guys look, I mean, you're doing great work. It's obviously very expensive putting together this infrastructure to bring all this data together. You guys look like consulting companies. So is there something else going on? Is this going to become a self-service piece that gets the scales by people using it without you helping them? Or is it going to become, or are you getting a piece of the CRO clinical trial discovery you're making? Or are you literally, and when you went to raise the money, how did you justify the valuation of the $30 million round comes with?
So I'm not going to answer the last question, and you know it, but good to answer, good to ask. When you ask that question, I feel like you're asking how do we write contracts, how do we charge for what we do. Our biggest contracts are SaaS-based contracts, basically, that look very much like any other enterprise solution. Inside, for example, a large health plan where we are the adjudication platform to tell them what's working or not in terms of the digital solutions that they deploy. Okay? Think of us as an operating system in that case. In other cases, for example, we're right now running a study for a digital health company that's prospective, randomized, control, to help them understand if their diabetes management point solution is actually impacting the cost and clinical profile in terms of the primary endpoints that they think. In that case, that's a statement of work contract where, very much in the Palantir model, we're deploying our platform to do essentially under a structured protocol, machine learning and analytics to derive an answer for them. I give them an answer and then I go away. If they want to get that answer over and over and over again, they can deploy our platform and it can be a SaaS contract. So I would say it's very much dependent on what they want to know and how long they want to know it for and when they want and what population characterization they want to know it in. But I would say we operate on both of those, operate on both of those spectrums. An investor recently asked me, are you a service-enabled technology or are you a technology-enabled service? And I said, which one do you want me to be?
Question, you mentioned proving yourselves out to health plans, and specifically I'm wondering if you could give an example of a health plan you work with, and I'm curious what they're looking for, especially in the context of the new value-based care movement, if you have any work in that area.
Yeah, so our strong viewpoint on that is that in the world of value-based care, you have to prove utility. A good friend of mine from my former company here, Kate, will recognize these words verbatim from how we used to do things in biotech and genomic diagnostics world, which is, it doesn't matter how accurate you are in a battle of a game where everybody's equally accurate. Okay? What matters is whether or not you matter clinically to the management of patients, which we refer to as clinical utility, and I'll give you specific examples of what that means, and whether or not you actually matter to the economics, right? So these are utility studies more than anything else. And so in the great game of, I think, genomics and digital health, which by the way have a lot of similarities, which is a whole other topic we can talk about if that's of interest, it's not enough to just be accurate. It really isn't, because there are already things that are accurate. You have to be able to be clinically, have clinical utility and change the management in a favorable way of a patient or change it in a more cost-efficient way, which is economic utility. And so when health plans are looking to, if they're going to make a medical policy decision on you, those two things are paramount. Like whether or not you have FDA approval, that is a ticket to play if you're required to have FDA approval. Not everybody is, obviously, right? But if you are, that is a ticket to play. We are no longer in a system where that gets you paid for. What gets you paid for, or covered, let's talk about covered and payment separately. What gets you covered is whether or not you have clinical utility, which gets you paid for at a payment rate based on economic utility. So the good news is, the studies, generally speaking, to prove clinical or economic utility are generally smaller than studies required to show a pivotal trial regulatory approvable endpoint, generally speaking. We're talking hundreds or maybe 1,000 patients as opposed to thousands of patients. It's not always true, but that's generally true. It's harder though, because you have to generally do it in a real world setting. And for some people, for some of you, that real world setting may be an oncology providers, like a MD Anderson. For some of you that, and believe me, this, I know how hard this is because I've done it. For some of you, that setting is going to be primary care. And trust me, those are very, very different settings. And so not just quantifying in studies your clinical utility, but quantifying studies your economic utility and doing it in the right setting is critical. Because if you don't, what the health plans will say is that I need to see that in my own population. So you have to do population similarity, essentially population trials in a similar population, if not the population. Now, there is a mechanism that's been used a little bit and increasingly more in recent years and last 5 to 7 years in healthcare, which is coverage with evidence development. And so increasingly, for very exciting new technologies where you have compelling data going in the door in your own population or in your own trials or in your own studies, many health plans will be willing to take a risk and they'll give you coverage on a limited population for a limited period of time while you prove to them that what you say is true. That's increasingly viable, I think, and we're starting to see certainly signals of that, at least in my discussions with health plans. And we come into this game because we're the platform that a lot of the health plans use to try and understand what's working or not. And so I'm telling you this answer from what I hear in those conversations, right?
Does that hold true for self-insured employers that you're trying to approach?
So we actually don't deal in the self-insured employer channel at all. In part because we haven't tried to, and so, but also because they haven't come to us. So we were really, really fortunate when we launched. We went from 5 companies in the pipeline to 70 companies in the pipeline in a 2-week period. The vast majority of those companies were digital health companies, health plans, and biopharma. 0 of those companies were self-insured employers.
Hi, Deb. It's Amanda.
I know, I see you.
So one of the things that makes healthcare so exciting / frustrating to work in is that the technology is way ahead of where the policy is sometimes. So what you're doing with data is amazing. How long do we have to wait, and what are the big signals that this is changing that we should look out for? That clinical trials are moving away from simply survival into quality of life with maybe survival as a secondary or complementary data point. It's one thing to sort of prove the value when you're in the world of managing your chronic disease. You're managing well or it's not. You're going to the hospital when you shouldn't or you're not. But increasingly, as we push the envelope in cancer, we're getting people living longer, but is that 4 days that they got in the clinical trial? Woohoo, approval and reimbursement. Was it worth it? You can answer that question. How long are we going to have to wait until reimbursement and FDA approval catches up to taking that into account the way they should?
So we do have examples now, and by the way, examples even in our own pipeline to kind of help them answer this question where the regulatory authorities have told companies who are asking essentially for label expansion. So let's say they're in the phase 4 setting, they've got their initial indication for their therapeutic. But by the way, they've also done pivotal trials on this other, what historically in healthcare we call pleiotropic effect, right? So we didn't think this was a thing, but now it's a thing, and we went and proved that it's actually a beneficial effect. And when they've gone back to the FDA's response in multiple occasions for those drugs has been, that's great. We actually believe that it's doing what you say it's doing, but we're not sure it matters. And translated, that means quality of life metrics. And so what I see starting to happen is the regulatory authorities looking at quantification of quality of life as a justification for label expansion. right? And that's significant because that's the gateway to justification for pricing, right? Because that's generally the way the pricing waterfall works, right, in biotech and pharma. And so I view that as really, really positive because it means that, if you go back to my data universe that I had on that earlier slide, that means that quality of life metrics suddenly and instantaneously become very important, right? The second that we start talking about label expansions on the basis of QL metrics, and the minute that I tell you that I can get them all the time, right, it empowers companies not just in the therapeutics world, but in the diagnostics world and in the digital health world especially, to be able to go to any agency that now is going to take their cue from the FDA's draft guidance on whatever, right? So I view this as a sequence of steps, and I already see that starting to happen. Yeah.
Do you complement or compete against CROs?
Both. We have CROs approach us essentially to add us in as a logo piece. We know that you guys can quantify behavior-driven outcomes, and we've got a client who's asking for that. And by the way, big consulting companies come to us for that too. And so we're like, sure, we'll do that. And then absolutely, am I in the middle of deal flow and deal channels where those same budget dollars might be spent on an answer that comes from innovation versus an answer that comes from a clinical or traditional CRO? For sure. But we're answering the question in fundamentally different ways. And so it kind of comes down to, it comes down to a lot of things. Like it comes down to whether or not that use case is in the phase 3 setting versus the phase 4 setting, whether or not that use case is purely about clinical or purely economical, whether or not it's about quality of life. It really, really depends on the kinds of questions that are being asked as to whether or not we're the best model to answer it. But for sure, we're both right now.
Hi, I was wondering if you could touch on whether you broke out your customer base based on the product that they're selling. Do you have clients that are the buyer, not the seller? Like, do you have any providers where the protocol design committee wants to compare A and B, or an insurance company that wants to decide the reimbursement policy?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, our largest customers are health plans. On the provider side, our provider side partnerships generally for us, they're not our revenue sources per se. Think of our provider system relationships as being, a different form of a connected population that has data that we can help them access, right? Or that our analytics capabilities can help them make sense of. For example, if they have very large Medicare or Medicare Advantage populations and they want to justify, higher reimbursement for Medicare on the basis of diabetic outcomes in Medicare Advantage, we can help them do that. In those cases, yes, they would pay us. But in many cases, the non-revenue partnerships that we have with provider systems are all about population and connectivity in our platform and whether or not that data can help them meet a business need and help us, have another form of data or another type of population that we might not have. Our largest customers, generally speaking, in terms of the biggest or meatiest questions and the most complicated kinds of contracting are health plans, for sure. And they're using us to try and understand what works and who it works in and when it works and how much is it worth.
Are you working with pharmaceutical companies?
Yeah, the question is, do we work with pharmaceutical companies? Yes, for sure, yes.
And then do you bring this evidation back, or do they again come up and ask you for an evidence-based question?
Let me make sure I understand what you're asking. Are you asking whether or not they install our platform and use it as an enterprise solution, or whether or not we come back and give them an answer? But it's both. It's actually the same answer that I was giving the gentleman earlier. It really depends on whether or not, I'll give you a good example. So in pharma companies in particular. So let's say that they're a pharmaceutical conglomerate, they work across all major therapeutic areas, right, of chronic disease. And they first, because a lot of the money there is controlled by the brand team or the brand franchise, they first have a question that's really relevant to heart failure. And we go in and help them figure that out, and then across the fence, the hypertension brand says, you know what, we have kind of the same problem. And then the diabetes people go, we have kind of the same problem too. At that point, we look more like an enterprise solution, right?
Especially now, there's so much of biomarker studies, there's so much of multi-phase studies, there's so much of combination studies. So would you do that because you already have that kind
Yeah, right. So I didn't talk about biological data or genomic data because right now that's something that we generally don't offer as a solution in a productized form, but we absolutely are working with multi-channel genomic biologic data, sort of more in the early stage form to try and understand how it fits into the overall channel data sets we have. But I would say most of the pharma and biotech engagements or questions they come to us with fit into sort of one of three categories. One, they just want to understand the label populations in terms of behavior because they know that real life behaviors are driving the outcomes that are ultimately driving pricing-based value, or value-based pricing rather, but they don't know what that is. And so they're not willing to go into those contracts until they understand something about their label populations. That's the first thing. The second thing gets into this nuance that Amanda just brought up, which is, right, what are all the other things that are going on in the lives of these patients that we think are actually benefiting from our therapeutic? And so you get into all kinds of nuances around quality of life and other types of outcomes, as well as economics, right? And so that's a whole category. And then the third category is the most complicated, which is how can we understand what types of behaviors are going to lead to what types of outcomes someday, because we know that those outcomes are costing us a lot, either in clinical compromise or governance of our clinical efficacy signal, or in terms of cost efficiency. And those three categories are, everything we do generally fits into one of those in terms of the questions, but you can imagine there's a lot in there, right? There's when you can have this kind of data access, you can begin to look at the questions in a whole different way, which is why we run directly in sometimes to a complement as a CRO to a CRO solution versus a competitor to a CRO solution.
Hi, Deb. Thanks so much for attending tonight. I'd love to understand from your experience, outside of Omada Health, what are some digital health or consumer tech companies that you feel have really nailed that clinical utility, decision impact, economic utility studies to integrate into the payer system? And what did they do?
So unfortunately we don't have huge numbers of peer-reviewed publication evidence, right, of all this happening. What I can say is just in the discussions that we have, I'll give you a couple of examples of where I know people are doing it really well. And whether or not it's published yet or whether or not it's publicly available, I don't know. For example, the level of evidence generation and data analytics and evidence the depth of the questions they're asking at Gluco is very impressive. I've sat on panels with different members of their executive team over the last year, and I will tell you the way that they're thinking and the way that they look at the requirement to show impact is very comprehensive, and it's very impressive to me. Again, I can't speak to what's published or what's been presented in peer-reviewed government abstracts, but what they're doing is really impressive. I can also say, without disclosing company names, that some of the stuff that we've done with companies in both chronic cardiometabolic disease, as well as very specifically in type 2 diabetes, if you're going to play in those areas, you better bring it. People are very serious about evidence generation, and they're doing it behind the scenes, they're doing it quietly, and they won't even let us, in some cases, disclose that we're working with them because they don't want anybody who knows what they're doing. But these are serious, prospective, multi-arm, randomized controlled studies with thousands of people. And so if you're working in spaces where that's the evidence bar, you just can't not do it. It's just, because that's how they're spending their Series A and their Series B now. What I can't say is how many of the healthcare buyer community are going to adjudicate their decisions purely on the basis of that, because it's just still early, right? And so we don't have enough evidence of that yet. What we do know is that Omada's had a lot of good things happen on the basis of data, right? We do know that. And so we just don't have enough use cases yet where we can point to something happening in the market and point to, they did this and this happened. But, it's coming. We've got a really exciting engagement that we're just now kicking off with a large health plan in type 2 diabetes to essentially, it's not a head-to-head, but we're evaluating two very significant diabetes digital management solutions in separate prospective randomized studies in parallel, but not head-to-head. So my point is, this is getting for real. It's playtime's over. This is for real. It is no longer acceptable to not have evidence, and you got to do it. But we just don't have enough we don't have enough adjudication in the market yet of where that bar is actually going to be. Yeah. I don't think.
How, sort of building on that question, how would you see that bar of evidence fall outside of, I guess, diabetes, which is what you talked about largely in other areas of digital health, including behavioral health and digital behavioral health solutions?
So all I can do is say that, you know, healthcare buyers seem to make decisions on the basis of precedent practice, right, and precedent process. And precedent process dictates that you go through a medical policy decision and that you go through, and if you get through that and you're covered, right, that you now got to go through an adjudication process and contract and get a payment decision. Whether you're in pharma and you're trying to work your way up formulary, or whether you're in, you know, diagnostics and your lab test and you're trying to get a payment level that justifies your margin. That is all based on evidence, period. Like that's how it works, right? And so I don't see it being therapeutic area specific. What I will say is that there is smaller and more curated and more, I would say more difficult and challenging a population you have. For example, no option patients in metastatic brain cancer, right? That becomes easier to justify in terms of just having survival clinical benefit than, for example, proving economics in chronic hypertension with generic drugs, right? So you have very different things at play in terms of survival and what survival means, and we as a society still value that highly, of course. But economics have become so much a part of the equation that I don't see outside of oncology, and I'll put oncology aside because I do think it's special and I think it operates in its own sort of different system. Outside of oncology, I don't see a lot of differences shouting out at me as being, having different evidentiary standards by therapeutic area. I just don't. Now, I'm not sitting in a health plan. I'm not the expert to answer that, but that's just what I see. But I do see cancer being special. I think it still is. I don't know how long it will be. And I think different subsets of cancer are now, with patients living longer, you're starting to see different practices around decision-making and coverage and payment for those patients than you used to. So that trend should continue, but I still think cancer kind of operates a little bit differently.
Within a health plan, who do you typically sell to, or which groups of people? And then how do you interact with the health economics and outcome group? It sounds like what you're talking about is somewhat the core competency of that group, seeing what works or doesn't. So how do you go into health plan and say, we're doing exactly what this team of hundreds of people is doing, but we're going to do it better, and therefore you should pay us for that?
So generally speaking, health outcomes researchers don't do what we do. Health outcomes researchers, A, they do very sophisticated modeling, and B, they might hang economic endpoints in a trial. But most economics generally do not come from prospective randomized studies in and of themselves, even today. That's just generally not how it works. Now, that said, even in the case where healthcare economists or healthcare outcomes researchers are trying to answer the same question that we may be able to answer for them, they're coming to us because we're doing something they can't do themselves, which is we're ingesting enormous amounts of real-life data and making sense of it for them. I mean, to give you a sense of the scale here, we take in 1 billion activity data points a month. So we're not talking about something that people generally are going to be able to do in-house right now inside a health outcomes team, inside a health plan. So to then answer the first part of your question, which is, who do we sell to? First of all, health plans are not our sole customer channel, so let's not really focus on that. But to answer your question directly, sometimes we sell into the wellness or consumer-facing or member-facing part of that channel. Sometimes we sell into the actual health outcomes innovation team. And then sometimes we're selling directly into the IT or innovation/digital solutions team, which is looking for a better analytics way to look at their data. It depends. I mean, health plans are not ubiquitous, right? There's 5 really big ones right now at the moment. There's maybe there'll be 4 depending on the DOJ, but they really do operate fairly differently in terms of how they're integrating digital health, in terms of how they're integrating machine learning and analytics, and the scale at which they're operating at with regard to data ingestibility. I was just recently in a top 5 health plan just in August talking about, they were engaging with us on something they wanted us to do with regard to, using us to kind of tell what's working or not in this big therapeutic area. And they are passing around flat files. Okay, so that is the reality of where we are in a lot of these big companies, and so we're walking in there with just a fundamentally different skill set. But to be honest, I mean, we don't go into channels or directly into customers where we think we are going to compete directly against them unless we know we can win, because I don't have too much other things to do, right? So we really carefully choose who we're going to try and engage with, because I don't want to waste my sales team's time. We're not everything to everybody, for sure.
I'll just jump in here while we're passing the mic. Can you talk a little bit about accuracy when you're pulling data from consumer devices? So for instance, I've used in the past 3 different ways to track my sleep, and I get 3 different options and gave up because I was like, I have no idea who to trust here. Is that an issue for you, and how are you addressing it?
So the question from our Modi founder is whether or not the accuracy of the API actually is relevant. And the answer is really relevant, but let me break that down, because there's a lot of things in that question that are relevant to us and how we do things. So I think at the first order, if we don't try to validate the accuracy of your signal. For example, if a consumer tech company comes to us and says, we want you to help us understand how let's use sleep tracking, how our sleep tracker is actually impacting people's diet patterns. Let's just throw those out there. We don't actually, in that case, try to validate whether their sleep tracker is quote unquote accurate. We take that as it is. We're way more concerned with the cleanliness of the API and whether or not the design of the study can account for whether or not it's accurate. For example, a lot of what we do in that situation would just be massive amounts of normalization across large populations, such that the actual variability between tracker to tracker in that case actually kind of may not matter. We also do a ton of stuff with pre-post intervention studies, right, where the patient is essentially their own control, in which case, as long as they're using the same technology and that technology is performing consistently, it doesn't matter if it's off, as long as it's consistently off, right? And so it just sort of matters in terms of the question that we're asking. We generally, as I'll say this as a blanket statement, we generally do not take off-the-shelf APIs. Now, our APIs for behavior data, I think right now are around 150 if you break out the aggregators and pull those as individual sources. Generally speaking, we customize the vast majority of APIs for use in studies for this reason, because we don't want to use things that are going to actually impact the answer or the endpoint that we're getting. And so we either get around that by massive amounts of smart filtering on the front end, cleaning the API and customizing it for our use on the front end, or on the back end, sort of in the messy middle, dealing with it in the way that we design studies to start with. So it just sort of is an issue, but we minimize the impact of the issue through other means, if that makes sense. But it is an issue for sure, yeah.
Great, so it seems like a large part of the value that you guys bring from the cohorts that you are able to recruit and then integrate the data. How do you recruit engaged people and keep them engaged throughout the length of the study? And then the second part of the question is, dovetails off of this one a little bit, but when you collect this data, this is very novel, especially when you think about it in a healthcare setting, incorporating real-life data. How do you validate that the data that you're providing is actually demonstrates the question that you're asking? Because it's very different than traditional forms of data.
So we're talking like bleeding edge stuff here, right? So I'm not going to sit here and suggest to you that we figured everything out. And the customers know that, right? This is the very first time in the history of these companies they've used data like this. So there is definitely a learning process that we're all going through at once, for sure. That said, you're bringing up a really important point that I have neglected to mention this entire time, which is, why do patients give us data? So historically in clinical trials, patients usually get paid something to be in a clinical trial. And it could be as simple as a payment when they get through the final time point. I'm talking about like in traditional healthcare land. In past companies I've been a part of, if we needed blood samples, in the 30-day acute time period after an implant, a drug delivery device, we put them and their families up at a hotel in the time points that we needed to get blood, right? So there would be an incentive there for them to be there. We've now entered the point in time where patients suddenly have the most powerful asset of all time, which is data. And so we pay them for it. And so just like people have been paid over time to be episodically in clinical trials, like we'll pay you all the time. And so think of our platform on the connected population side as ingesting data, but giving patients something back for that. And so that's the answer to your question of why do they stay responsive. And actually, I'm going to exchange your word engagement for responsiveness, because I actually don't care if patients engage with our platform on a daily basis. I'm way more concerned if they're responsive to a call to action. And so we measure our responsiveness of the population on the basis of that, and we keep them responsive because they have an asset and we're buying it. And we believe very strongly in the future of healthcare being patient-mediated outside of incentive structures, but because data is a new asset that they own. So then the first part of your question, which is actually in many ways the hardest part of this, which is how do you go find the people who fit inclusion criteria? I'm going to use that's exactly what you're asking with regard to, right? And so we sort of attack that in two ways. One, we have enormous numbers of people on the platform at any given time, such that we essentially, if we do our job right, will match prevalence levels in the general population according to the major therapeutic conditions in our pipeline, right? That's if we do our job right. By the way, the job is really hard, so we don't always get it right. So that means the second thing we have to go do is we have to go find people. Now, in the last 10 years, who are really good at finding people? It's not healthcare, I can tell you that. They're not. In my IRS, yeah. Consumer technology companies are really, really good at finding people. I can tell you right now that Etsy thinks that I want a scarf. Right? They're really, really good at finding out that they're probably right. It's kind of getting cool outside. My office is in San Mateo, they know that. Right? So what I'm saying is that there are ways of taking sort of best practices of phenotyping that are completely working in other parts of our lives and now apply it into healthcare. And so when we go and recruit people, we use very much the same sorts of technologies, only now, by the way, we're completely transparent when we're doing it. And the reason we're completely transparent is because we're going to pay you, right? It all goes back to patient empowerment as being the holder of the data that is now an asset that should be monetized. So that part of our business model is really, really, it's so funny. I forget to bring it up all the time because it's so part and parcel of what we do. I kind of forget about it, even though I recognize it's actually quite novel in healthcare.
We have time for one more question.
Quick.
Wait, we're recording, so here's the mic.
I'll shout. So this is just related to what you just said, but obviously there's a small fruit company in South Bay that has one of these, and well, it was probably not this one, but
Yeah.
And they have a little research kit, which seems to be an ally, but also could be competition depending on what the hell they do, and no one knows what they do, they're going to do, but somebody somewhere that knows. But
yeah.
you just riff a bit about the power of those huge consumer companies who have this technology to do some of what you're doing. There's a lot of fear and dread about what they do in healthcare as a whole.
Sure. I'll just say what I know as a consumer about the products. One of the things that we know about Apple, if you read between the lines of everything that Tim Cook says and everything that they say in their analyst reports and everything they talk about with regard to their business models, they don't hold data. They actually don't, right? Google does, Facebook does, every other major player in the valley does, Apple doesn't. Right? And so, I would say that's the first, you're always, essentially your question is sort of like, what is your basis of competition against a company like that? And, our basis of competition is squarely on behavior data, no question about it. That's the first thing. The second thing is the connected population, right? So this responsiveness to this population that is responsive to a call to action, as relevant to that data, as relevant to the question that we're trying to answer for a company. And so that's, absolutely, can they do this? For sure they can do this, but they don't seem to want to do this exactly. But we'll see. Yeah. Maybe they are doing it.
Cool. Well, with that, we are going to wrap up. We're short on time. Before we thank Deb as a group, I just wanted to say I checked in with Polly Esrani, who has a marketing communications for Evidation. If there's any follow-up questions, we're going to do a follow-up email this week. Probably put you in the direction of Polly, who will filter those questions and get it to the right person at Evidation, or you can post questions through direct messaging on Twitter for the handle is Evidation. So with that, let's give a thank you, round of applause to Deb.